saw the huge cat was following close behind. The creature appeared to be dropping down onto 4 feet, as though it had been standing fully erect on its hind legs to pull the door to. That was surely an optical illusion, but how had the cat tugged the door shut? "Watch your step," cautioned Mr. M., drawing my attention from the cat. The narrow hallway began a steep descent by stone steps as the left wall abruptly ended in darkness, leaving the steps to descend along a narrow ledge. I followed carefully, keeping to the remaining wall, but glancing fearfully into the abyss of darkness to my left. The steps continued their descent, growing darker, then brighter, as we ventured from one candlelit spot to the next. I found myself wondering who maintained all the candles. Mr. M. had mentioned others responsible for the shop sign, but that number would surely be small, no more than 2, maybe 3. Far too few for the scores of candles. "What the hell am I doing here?" I muttered, considering whether to complain. A prospective customer surely ought to be served, not made to wander dangerously along the margin of such utter darkness, where a single false step would send one plunging confounded from the light, however dim. I had just opened my mouth to express my reservation when Mr. M. announced, "Ah, here we are." I looked and saw that while the ledge kept descending, we had stepped down onto a landing, a pause in the descent. The wall to our right was hollowed out into an unilluminated room whose entrance was blocked by a massive portcullis. Mr. M. gestured with a downward motion. "Would you please open that for us?" I naturally assumed he was speaking to me, but as I prepared to protest that I knew nothing of such infernal devices, I heard chains clanking and gears grinding metal against metal as with impetuous recoil and jarring sound the portcullis began forthwith to screech its way rapidly up. I looked behind me and saw, with astonishment, that Behemoth was pulling down on a great chain, the large cat's claws hooked into 2 of its links. At that very moment, I began to think of Behemoth more as person than cat, like a short, stocky fellow in a cat suit. And I watched as he quickly drew the chain down, unhooked the lower claws from their link, and reached high to rehook those same claws into another link, all the time continuing to pull as he alternated paw over paw. When the heavy grating had been harshly and completely raised, Behemoth caught one of the chain's big links onto an iron hook set firmly in the stone landing, and the portcullis remained open. The room must have been very large, and it was seemingly markedly darker even than the abyss now behind us. For though my vision was no longer disturbed by the grating of the now high updrawn portcullis, there stretched out before us a dark, illimitable ocean without bound, without dimension, where length, breadth, and height, and time and place were lost. Or so it seemed. But the undaunted Mr. M. took up an unlit torch from among several lying on the floor, ignited it from the flame of a nearby candle, and motioned me to advance. "Stay close beside me within this light." I saw that Behemoth remained behind, as if to guard the open way, but against what? Mr. M. strode forth with remarkable alacrity. I hurried to follow close behind, wondering how he knew his direction in such thick darkness, by what angles ken he judged. But we hadn't proceeded far when he suddenly stopped, so suddenly I very nearly crashed into him. "Yes, here it is," he declared. He extended the torch into what seemed a nook, but a nook within what I was unable to determine. We entered the small alcove, where Mr. M. located a hole in the wall at arm's length above our heads, and slipped the torch handle in. Apparently, it was designed for that. I then saw lining the walls of this small room hundreds, maybe thousands of bottles, each one corked like wine. "Wines?" I guessed. "Why, no," Mr. M. softly murmured. as though reluctant to contradict. "These are corked beers." I peered more closely in the flickering torchlight. What he said was true. Not only were the bottles stubbier than most wine bottles, their labels identified them as beers in the broadest sense. Ales, wheats, porters, stouts, whatever sort one might care to tally. "These all look old," I remarked. "They must have lost carbonation from their long storage." "None," he assured. "What about cork rot?" "Never." "Never?" I challenged. "Our firm guarantee," he promised. "Contract immediately dissolved if that should happen." I looked at him, puzzled. Who would ever contract for a beer? Were these so expensive? "The bottles can also be recorked if you're momentarily satiated and wish to return to the beer later," he added. "Just press the cork back in." That was simply too much. If there were a good beer's worth of carbonation, the cork would pop right out. I looked more closely at the bottles. The corks were held in place by nothing at all. There could certainly be no carbonation in these dusty old bottles. Mr. M seemed to read my thoughts. "Let me assure you with more than words," he said, selecting a bottle and holding it up in his left hand. "Shoggoth's Old Peculiar," he declared, exactly as promised. I studied the proffered article. The bottle was covered with dust and tangled with cobwebs. No beer could possibly stay good that long. It would be flat and long since turned. "No thanks," I retorted. "We might have spared our coming here. I wouldn't taste or touch that stuff." Mr. M drew himself up to his full height. I shrank back, involuntarily. "Can you," he queried solicitously, "already drink no further drink? Is one last beer then forbidden you?" "Of course not," I protested. "I can drink any bottle of beer I wish, so long as the beer is good. This one is obviously bad." "Ah," he murmured, "opportunity lost is opportunity cost, and you have been misled. Corked beer of this sort keeps its taste and effervescence forever, as I have already promised." What do the beer snobs know? They care only for their reputation and influence, and would keep you low and ignorant, that you might revere their great knowledge of beer and denigrate yourself. "Oh yes, they and their great knowledge." Mr. M, waxing indignant at the wrong done to a beer lover like me, seemed to grow in zeal and passion. "Those great snobs know that if they not let you taste the beers they forbid, you shall never truly know beer's good and bad, nor the real distinction between virtuous and vicious drinking. But just one sip of this, and your eyes that seem so clear, but are yet dim, shall perfectly be then opened and fully cleared, and you shall know all these things. Believe me, for I have tasted, and now know. Or," he said, popping the cork, which made a satisfying whump, proof of strong carbonation, "take some, and freely taste for yourself." Could the odd fellow be right? I wondered. He was right about the carbonation, but the flavor? Surely that had turned. I then caught a whiff of the beer's fine bouquet, carrying with it a promise of great pleasure for the tongue, and I suddenly realized how thirsty I was from so much walking, not only outside, earlier, but especially down those long steps. Moreover, I'd had no alcohol for several days while searching for the perfect beer. I desired a drink. Was there a downside to this? Surely the drink would not kill me. I reached for the bottle. "There's just one more thing," Mr. M admitted, sounding diffident as he drew the bottle back out of reach. Somewhat cross, I stood there, my hand stretched forth and suspended in emptiness, grasping nothing. "What?" I groused. "Once you have tasted this beer," explained Mr. M, enunciating his words carefully, "you will not be able to stop. So, you first need to fully understand the precise conditions for taking possession of this drink before its spirit takes possession of you." What an odd manner of speaking, I thought. But the fellow was a foreigner, nor could I deny sometimes acting like a man possessed after a few drinks too many. What manner of conditions? I inquired. Well, he mused, as though waiting for the proper words. I'm a collector of curiosities. I'm not in this business for material reasons, but you might say I have spiritual needs. Yes, that might be the best way to put it. I deal in spirits. A curt nod of his head indicated the countless bottles, and I noticed the room was larger than I had initially perceived. In return for the spirits I offer, I ask a spirit from you. He extended the index finger of his left hand in my direction, the other fingers wrapped firmly about the shoggoths. I've nothing to trade, I confessed. I'm out of alcohol. Not that sort of spirit from you, he said. Just your spirit. I was baffled. My spirit? Yes, he confirmed. Yours. He offered a smile of gentle irony and added, I understand your confusion. After all, what is a human spirit? I'm told it's nothing, and perhaps that's true. The fellow paused, giving me a chance to interrupt. My human spirit, I said. You mean something like my soul? You might say that, he acknowledged. Do you have one? Metaphorically speaking, I suppose I do, I replied, giving myself time to think. After all, what did these words spirit and soul mean? Did they even refer to the same thing? What kind of thing, anyway? I had never given the matter much thought. There was soul music and soul food, but that just meant something ethnic. If I thought of my own soul, it seemed to have some connection to my feelings. As for spirit, I could only think of things like team spirit or school spirit. Those seemed to mean a kind of energy. Maybe like spirited? Feelings? Energy? Not much difference between the two, really. Both rather fleeting, insubstantial. You don't seem to want very much, I finally observed, though I felt a slight unease about his intentions. As you say, he conceded, and beckoned me to a shagreen-topped table, previously unnoticed, about which were positioned a couple of chairs. I sat down as he placed the uncorked bottle there on the flat, carefully burnished surface of oriental leather, and opened a drawer from which he produced 2 large sheets of paper. In artistically beautiful and large calligraphy were written the following terms. The undersigned contractee agrees, in exchange for possession of the spirit of a bottomless bottle of beer, to tender to the contractor, Mr. Falland M., possession of the spirit of the contractee. Below this agreement, on each sheet, were the words contractee, contractor, and witness. Witness? I remarked, looking about. Is Behemoth going to come and sign as well? No, certainly not, replied Mr. M., looking aghast. Cats are slippery, ambiguous creatures who never mean what they say and thus cannot be trusted with contracts, especially Behemoth. Besides, he has difficulty grasping fine pins, and his signature is illegible. I like a clean, clear contract. He pointed to the 2 sheets, evidently, or so it seemed, with pride at their unstained beauty, and then added, as witness we have Azazello. I looked up from the contracts, and was nearly startled from my chair at the abrupt appearance of a 3rd individual seated alongside the table in a 3rd chair. His sudden presence was frightening enough, but far worse were his looks, for one eye pierced me to the core, but the other, as if askew, gazed steadily at something unseen. And though his mouth was grimly shut, a single sharp tooth, one might even say a fang, protruded over his lower lip, lending the fellow a menacing appearance. My alarm must have shown, for Mr. M. reassured me. Oh, don't worry about Azazello. He's entirely reliable. Why, one time in Moscow, Mr. M. began, then seemed to reconsider and decide not to recount the anecdote. But I don't wish to take up your valuable time with tiresome stories of faraway adventures. Let us proceed so that you might enjoy your drink. I remembered my powerful thirst, further whetted by the ambrosial ambience with which the old peculiar's fine bouquet had filled the room. "Do you have a pen?" I asked. "Not exactly," replied Mr. M. "We have a pin instead." Uncomprehending, I looked at him and saw that he was holding a long, sharp pin. "It's to draw a little blood." This was beginning to sound creepy, and I wondered if I should back out, but I again recalled my intense thirst and inhaled once more the wonderful bouquet. "Blood?" I said, "instead of ink? Why?" I'd heard of sacred oaths signed in blood, of course, but I had never taken such stories seriously. They were just stories. "Why blood?" Mr. M. replied, nodding. "Yes, good question. Why indeed? Well, there's a venerable old view that the blood is the life. You might have heard the expression." I shook my head. "Regrettable," he observed. "Wisdom of the ancients should never be neglected. I can, however, briefly explain. One ancient view, a view I've long shared, is that the seat of the soul is the blood. Indeed, the blood itself is the soul. If we take spirit as synonym for soul, then you see what I'm intimating." "Not entirely," I admitted. "By signing in blood," he explained, "you are offering a promissory note on your agreement to provide your spirit." "I see." I didn't especially like the suggestion or demand for my blood, even if merely a small amount, but my great thirst had by now grown overpowering. "Fine," I agreed. "Excellent," Mr. M. announced. "Let us, as I earlier said, proceed." Azazello seemed to know precisely what to do, almost as if the procedure were routine. He rose from his chair and wordlessly came to me, took the ring finger of my left hand, squeezed hard above the final joint, and jabbed the tip while squeezing more firmly so that the blood oozed forth and, much to my wonderment, into what turned out to be a hollow pin. Upon judging it full, he stopped and held the pin out for me to accept. I took it. "Now," instructed Mr. M., "sign your name." The small pin, now a pen,